Hello, I'm Sleepy7, and before I go to bed, I wanted to talk about the Secret Lair Dan Dan deck, as well as the Dan Dan deck I made. So, I'm a Magic player. I like to play Magic, and Dan Dan is one of my favorite formats. So, Dan Dan is a shared 80 card deck format where it's like basically normal Magic rules, except there's just a shared deck and a shared graveyard, and you know everything else is basically otherwise the same. And this has been my deck for a pretty good while. Um, I want to say like definitely set like maybe three maybe years before. I actually don't remember the timeline specifically, but I know I've had this just for a pretty long while before the Dan Secret Lair Dan Dan deck came out. And me being a fan of Dan Dan, when this was announced, I was like, well, I gotta get it. You know, gotta see how Wizards does their official format. And I guess a brief history of Dan Dan. Uh, It was made by a person named Nick Floyd. And from what I understand, he just like sort of wanted to play Magic with his cousin or something, but all he had was just a bunch of cards, and so he decided to just like slam together a bunch of like blue cards or whatever, and he ended up with the very first Dan Dan deck back in like 1990 something. And then it was published online in like 2016 or something like that. And then it was popularized maybe in 2023. And then this deck came out in like 2025. I don't research these things, so that's just a very quick and dirty history of the format. And so, as you can see, this is already unsealed. So here's a little annoying thing that happened. Was originally this I was gonna make a video that was like an unsealing unboxing of this deck, and I had recorded everything. Everything was all going fine, and then it turns out I was only recording audio and not the video. So now I have to redo this, and now it's not sealed, and that kind of annoys me a lot because I spent over an hour on the video before I went to bed, and all that went to waste. But whatever, I guess it gives me something to talk about to pad the time. But anyway, let's start opening up this deck. So sign right here. So I guess you don't get my initial reactions or anything. So some of this is just going to be just kind of going through, like, oh, here's a life counter. It goes all the way to 40. First, you start on this side. And this one goes from 1 to 20. And then this side goes from 21 to 40. So you can use it in Commander, or you can use it in, normal Dan Dan Forgetful Fish, which is the other name for this format, Forgetful Fish. You get two of them because it's a two-player format. Here's like the fold out rule page, I guess. It's not really much of a rule book, but it's also like, oh, look, it's a poster of one of the card arts, I guess. I don't like creases in posters, so, that just annoys me. But hey, it is what it is. It's not really meant to be a poster anyway. Where did this come from? Oh, the deck box, little coating on it. It's like rubberized coating is like coming off of it. Oh, that's great. So, as you can see, I already sleeved the whole deck in like just penny sleeves. There was like a whole thing at the end of the video where I just went and sleeved the deck and talked about stuff. But I plan on replacing these sleeves eventually when I get thematically appropriate sleeves for this deck. But anyway, let's talk about Dan Dan. So here's Dan Dan, the titular card. Yeah, it's like yin and yang, dude. But yeah, this is a 4/1 fish for 2 blue mana that can't attack unless the defending player controls an island. But if you control no islands, you sacrifice it and it dies, which is one of the key things about this format. It's a pretty big beater. 5 hits from a fish and you die. But it's like a game of chicken, kind of. So, whoever plays the first island is vulnerable to attack. Whoever doesn't play an island is not vulnerable to attack, but they can't have a Dan Dan out. So, it's that sort of consideration. Now, that said, from what I understand, that kind of unbalances the format because it tends to be a very dominant strategy to just not ever play an island, because then you'll never be attacked, and then it just becomes a game of attrition. Like whoever draws the last card, or the last card first, loses or whatever, or wait, no, wins, because technically you have to draw from an empty library. So yeah, I guess there are game design ways to get around that. So here's accumulated knowledge. So there's 4. So I guess I should talk about this too. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 whole Dan Dans. That's crazy. Why are there 9 Dan Dans? That's just how the format works, man. Since it's like one of the main cards, there's going to be a lot of them. There's typically only 2 copies of a card in this deck, except for Dan Dan and accumulated knowledge, and then also this memory lapse, but I'll talk about that when I get there. And for accumulated knowledge, the reason why is because you draw a card, then you draw cards equal to the number of cards named accumulated knowledge in all graveyards. So that's kind of like a mini game in the deck where, this is an instant draw spell, which is good because a lot of the deck revolves around manipulating the top card of the deck. But the issue with playing accumulated knowledge is that you only get the most out of it after someone else plays it, because then there's like accumulated knowledge in the graveyard, then you can cast one and draw more cards. So that it's kind of a second game of chicken right there. Like, who's going to be the first to cast it, Here's Magical Hack. This is a 1 mana instant, 1 blue mana. Change the text of target spell or permanent by replacing all instances of one basic land type with another. So, oh yeah. I installed a new light, like top-down light, so now I can bring it closer to the camera without glare. I guess I better do that with these two. Or, there's glare. I could bring it closer to the camera without it becoming dark, because the lights are off in my room, other than the ones that are lighting the stage. So that other Dan Dan art. Nice and good fish themed arts. I'm a big fish guy when it comes to aesthetics. So, Dan Dan as a format, built for me. But anyway, Magical Hack. As I said, it's a text changing card, but in this format, in other formats, this is kind of useless. Like, Magical Hack is just not a very good card, but in Dan Dan, it's a good card. Because if you look at Dan Dan, this creature can't attack unless the defending player controls an island. That kind of doesn't matter. But when you control no islands, sacrifice this creature. Well, you could use Magical Hack to change island with, I don't know, something like swamp or something. And then Dan Dan will say, when you control no swamps, sacrifice this creature. Well, there's no swamps in this format. So that's just instantly kills that Dan Dan, which is, good, because that's a 1 mana instant kill spell. Another thing I like about Dan Dan is how it kind of gives different cards that would normally be sort of useless, like a new role, and that just wouldn't be possible in other formats. Here's a memory lapse. This is the other very important card. As you can see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them. It's a counter spell, so it's up close to the camera so you can see that nice full art. So these full arts are exclusive to the deck. So counter target spell. If that spell is countered this way, put it on top of its owner's library instead of into the player's graveyard. So What's cool about this is that it becomes a battle of who gets the Dan Dan. You cast Dan Dan, then you cast Memory Lapse. Then Dan Dan goes back on top of the library, and then the player who goes next gets to draw that Dan Dan, and now it's theirs to play. But then you start fighting over the top of the deck. So, say you counter Dan Dan, it's on top of the deck, then you attempt to draw back the Dan Dan. Well, you can cast your own accumulated knowledge to draw it first. So, that's sort of a tension in the game format that I enjoy. Thinking about these sorts of things, the top of the deck as a resource, instant speed draw, like holding your mana, you to interact on your opponent's turn and stuff. I actually like to use Dan Dan as a tool to teach people how to play Magic because of how much it encourages you to think about cards as a resource, and think about interaction too. It's a shared deck, so you only need to bring your deck to teach someone. And I think that in a format this interactive, it really teaches like a player the value of interaction. Interaction is fun. It makes games fun. Here's Mystic Sanctuary. This is it's got seal people or something on it. So this is a land that says this land enters tapped unless you control 3 or more other islands. When this land enters untapped, you may put target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on top of your library. It helps you recur, you need like a kill spell. You need a memory lapse, that does it. Now, but what's important to remember is that it puts it on top of the library instead of in your hand. So you have to have an instant speed draw spell ready to get the card that the Mystic Sanctuary brought back. That said, you can also use this to block a card draw for your opponent, put like a bad instant or sorcery on the top of the deck. And then now they can't draw whatever is on, you can't draw like the Dan Dan that was countered and put on the deck or something. More mind games. Yeah, so here's some islands. That's the islands. These islands got cool art. So many islands, so many islands. Yeah, like I said, these full arts are exclusive to this deck, so this is the only place you can get these islands. Now, what's cool about these islands is watch this. There we go. That's kind of visible. It's a neat little panorama. I always enjoy panoramic lands. So I guess let's put it back in the right order, because otherwise I'm going to be annoyed. But yeah, islands, they're basic. They just tap for one blue, enter untapped. So the rest of these cards are just reprints of old art, but they're all in the retro frame. So some of these are like, first time printing in retro frame. Others are just like brainstorm. This art was originally printed in like Mercadian Masks, which was an old border set. So this isn't really all that new. Draw 3 cards, put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. So it's one of the best cantrips in the game, which are spells that draw you a card. All for 1 mana. You can do that at instant speed. You just draw 3 cards and then take the two worst cards of your hand and put it on top of the deck so you can junk up your opponent's draws. I know in Legacy, every deck that runs blue also runs Brainstorm, but in particular, Brainstorm is ran with Delver of Secrets, I believe it's called, which is a card that transforms into it's like a creature that transforms into an even bigger and badder creature. If at the beginning of your turn you reveal the top card of your deck and it's a sorcery or instant, you can use Brainstorm to stack the deck to guarantee that it transforms. Pretty cool. Here's a Capture of Jingzhou. Jingzhou. I don't know how to. Yeah, it's Chinese. I can't pronounce Chinese. But yeah, this is a reprint of a Portal 3 Kingdoms card, which was also a retro border set. but this is new because this is the first time it was printed in retro border and black border, because the original Portal 3 Kingdoms was in white border only. Another interesting thing about Portal 3 Kingdoms is that it was like an introductory set made to try to introduce Magic the Gathering to like Asia, especially China. And it was only released in Asia, China, Japan, all the Pacific Islands, and Australia. And because of that, it's a very rare set. A lot of the cards are hard to find, but also a lot of the cards are just kind of like functional reprints or slightly worse reprints of cards that already existed, like Capture of Jingzhou, Jingzhou, whatever, is a reprint of Time Warp. Like, it's literally just the same card, just different name. And, obviously by the name of the set, it's based on the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is one of the big Chinese like epic stories or whatever. And it's like historical fiction, so like a lot of these people and places are real places, but obviously it's fictionalized. So some of the first cards in Magic to just have real historical figures on them. Well, there's other cards too. Like there's a card with like Einstein on it for some reason, and then there's like the whole Arabian Nights set that has some like historical figures or whatever. Although I don't remember if they're historical figures or just like story. I don't know. I'm not a history buff. I'm not a history guy. So here's Chart a Course. Draw 2 cards, then discard a card unless you attack this turn. Yeah, that's good. It's a sorcery card that draws 2 cards. That makes you go up in card advantage by 1, but then it makes you discard a card, so that makes you go back down to net neutral card advantage. But since this whole attack with Dan Dan, attack, that gets you, it's a pretty easy condition to fulfill. So, that gets you 2 cards. I guess I should explain card advantage for people who aren't really trading card game people. So imagine that you take a turn and like the only action you do on that turn is draw a card. That makes you go up 1 in card advantage. And so you can see drawing cards as taking additional turns in that sense. So when you draw more and more cards, that's a good thing because it's almost as though you're taking more turns. Obviously, that's kind of like, not exactly true, because taking turns also includes like untapping everything, and then like you get to cast more spells and stuff, and your upkeep triggers and all that. But just bear with me. And so you want to think of things whenever you use a card. Well, you're losing cards when you use a card, so that makes you go down in card advantage. But you draw a card, that makes you go up in card advantage. So say this right here, this costs 1 card to play this, to cast this spell, but it draws you 2 cards. So that's a +2. That's -1 in card advantage, +2 in card advantage. That's a +1. But then it makes you discard a card, so that's -1 in card advantage. So that's net 0 card advantage. But if you attack, the downside of discarding a card doesn't exist anymore. So that's just drawing 2 cards. That's +2, -1. That's +1 in card advantage. This actually wasn't a concept that was really well understood in early Magic until like someone made a deck. I think it was actually called the deck, that was purely based around the concept of card advantage. And so that's my kind of shitty explanation of what card advantage is. If you want to look it up better, look up card advantage. There's way better explanations out there for me. There's like a whole book on it. There's Control Magic. So this is an interesting addition to the deck that isn't in common Dan Dan decks. So Control Magic, enchant creature, you control enchanted creature. So this is an enchantment, which it means that's a non-Dan Dan permanent in this deck. Traditionally, Dan Dan doesn't have any permanents other than lands in Dan Dan. I don't really like this addition to this deck because I don't like the fact that it's a permanent that isn't a land or a Dan Dan. But that's like, a decision that Wizards made that kind of differentiates this deck list from other lists, and I think that's fine. Crystal Spray. So this kind of does the same thing as Magical Hack. You can replace all instances of one color word or basic land type with another. And the difference is this costs 2 more generic mana, so it's 3 mana, like 2 generic plus 1 blue. And then it also draws you a card. So that's like a fairly on-rate kill spell because it's an instant speed kill spell that draws you a card for 3 mana. That's pretty on rate for as far as kill spells go. Like killing a creature technically costs like maybe 1.5 mana, and then drawing a card probably would make like baseline kill target creature, draw a card. Baseline that I would say that's probably like 4 or 5 mana. But for 3 mana, that's like really, really, really on rate. I guess like above rate actually. Here's Day's Undoing. Each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library and draws 7 cards. If it's your turn, end the turn. So this is a wheel. So wheel is a magic term for, discarding your hand, drawing some amount of cards, usually 7. And they're usually forced. So all players have to do it. And it's named after this card from the original Magic set called Wheel of Fortune. And it's one of the most expensive cards out there. Hooray. So this is just good for reloading the deck because, the graveyard, you want to get rid of you don't want to lose. What am I trying to say? I'm really tired. It's good for reloading the deck because it puts all the cards from the graveyard back into the deck, and you still do lose in this format if you draw from an empty deck. So that's an important thing to keep track of. And since there's 2 of them, you can kind of just do that infinitely over and over. Since I don't believe there's any way to like exile or effectively remove spells permanently, other than this card right here, Mental Note. Mill 2 cards, draw a card. So milling is you take the top card of the deck, put it into the graveyard, and I don't know why I did that, but yeah, if you mill both copies of Days Undoing, I guess it's just no way to play more Days Undoings unless you recur it some other way, but then you're getting into other complexities, so, So Mental Note is an instant speed mill card, lets you draw a card, so it's decent in this format because then you can get rid of like junk draws or whatever, anything that's on top of the deck. Manamorphose, put target permanent and opponent controls on top of its owner's library. That opponent may put an artifact, creature, enchantment, or land from their hand onto the battlefield. So this removes a Dan Dan that's already been played on the battlefield and puts it on the deck, letting you draw it next turn. But it does have the downside of it lets them put like a land or another Dan Dan, or like a land or maybe even control magic onto the battlefield. So there is that synergy with Metamorphose, I guess, with control magic. I don't know if I necessarily like that synergy in this deck, but it is like an extra layer. So that's not a bad choice to put control magic into this deck. Now here's Predict. You get to choose a card name and you mill a card. Then if a card with the chosen name was milled, you get to draw 2 cards. Otherwise, you just draw 1 card. So this is a fun card in this deck because it's all about top deck manipulation. So if you just know what's on top of the deck, you can draw 2 cards off of this pretty consistently. Telling Time. Look at the top 3 cards of your library. Put one of those cards into your hand. Put one on top of your library and one on the bottom of your library. Yeah, it's just a draw. It's a cantrip. It's a deck manipulation, instant speed, not much else to say about it. Unsubstantiate, return target spell or creature to its owner's hand. So this is like a functional counter spell, but it's also removal for creatures that are already on the battlefield. So, it's flexible in that sense. Halimar Depths. So this is one of the more important lands in the format. This land enters tapped. When this land enters, look at the top 3 cards of your library and put them back in any order. So that's just, you can play this land. It just does that for free. Obviously, functionally, it costs 1 mana to do that because it enters tapped. So technically, it's not free, but it's on a land. It's basically uncounterable. It's free. Haunted Fengraf. To sacrifice this land, return a creature card at random from your graveyard to your hand. So there's only Dan Dan in this format, so this will always return a Dan Dan from the graveyard to your hand. So the random part isn't really a downside in this format. This is a way to recur Dan Dans that are dead. So yeah, this is not something I've seen commonly put into Dan Dan decks, but that's not a bad addition to this deck, actually. Lonely Sandbar. Land enters tapped, and it has cycling for 1 blue. So cycling means you can pay the mana cost and then discard the card, and then you can draw a card. And it can be done at instant speed, so you can do it on your opponent's turn. This is essentially an uncounterable draw. So if you need to draw a card at instant speed to, say, draw a Dan Dan that was countered and put on the top of the deck, Lonely Sandbar might be for you. But it also, since it's a land, you could also use it to cast spells, so it's flexible. I don't know what else to say about it. Remote Isle does the same thing, except it costs 2 generic. Not much else to say about that. Here's the Surgical Bay. This land enters tapped. You can tap, add blue, and you can sacrifice the land to draw a card. So early game, this could be a mana for you. Late game, you could turn it into a card draw. It's kind of like the same idea as this, these cycling lands. Pretty good. Sylvanite Temple. This land enters tapped, and you get to, tap it to add blue, or tap it and sacrifice it to add 2 blue. So that's pretty cool because, that can lead to explosive plays right there just for the price of 1 land. You can play a single Dan Dan, or you can play, a counter spell or something, all just for 1 land. So it's another thing that your opponent just kind of has to keep track of. Here's a Vision Charm. So these cards aren't actually part of the deck. These are bonus cards that came with the deck. You can put them in the deck if you want and replace 2 other cards. I would imagine that you're probably going to be replacing Magical Hack because, let's just read. So it says, target player mills 4 cards, choose a land type and a basic land type. Each land of the first chosen type becomes the second chosen type until end of turn, and target artifact faces out. So, this is another type, text changing card, and for 1 mana, you get to destroy or kill just every single Dan Dan that's on the field. And Wizards thought that was too powerful for the deck, so they removed it, even though it's a staple card of the format. But they included them as bonus cards just because they know some people like to play with them. So that's just kind of the way it is. And so that's Dan Dan deck, the official Wizards Secret Lair one. Yep. And now for my Dan Dan deck. My Dan Dan deck is kind of a more standard one. I didn't do much special with it. I know there's a couple cards. I'm going to keep this Dan Dan deck together. I'm not going to take it apart or anything, but there are a couple cards I want to buy as singles just to replace some cards in my deck. So, let's go. So let's, we have Piracy Charm right here. Target creature, so you get to choose one. Target creature gains Island Walk till end of turn. And Island Walk is an ability that makes your creature unblockable if your opponent controls an island. So that, that's good to just keep pushing your Dan Dans through. They can't block them. Target creature gets +2/-1 till end of turn. So that option just kills a Dan Dan outright. or target player discards a card, which is also good because that's hand manipulation. It's probably going to be not the best card in your opponent's hand, but it's a card discard nonetheless. Remote Isle, also in the Dan Dan deck, but I guess I should point this out. So I don't know why they do this, but in like older sets, for some reason, these lands just had like kind of weird, like it's fallen. But anyways, in older sets, they kind of had like weird non-standard land borders for non-basic lands. As you can see, like for some reason, well, I guess this is a newer card, but whatever, point still stands. Same art and all that, old border, but like for some reason this has like yellow trim on it. I don't know why. This has blue trim on it. I don't know why. Here's Temple of Epiphany. It's a red and blue land that enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters, you get to scry one. So scrying is you get to look at the top card of your deck, and then you can choose to either put it back on top or put it on the bottom. So, it's free deck manipulation, essentially. So, as you can see, it adds one blue or one red. So, my version of Dan Dan, I run the red splash, which lets you run, like, one other card that other decks can't run or don't typically run if there's no red splash. I like it because you'll see. So here's Mystic Sanctuary. We know what that does. Nice retro border. There's a bunch of islands. We know what islands do. Yeah, this is the Brothers War Commander printing because it was the cheapest retro border island at the time. I'm probably going to replace it. Now, Unsubstantiate, we already know what that does. I want to replace this with the one from this deck, so I'm going to have to buy that as a single. Crystal Spray, we know what that does. Mental Note, we all know that. Here's Memory Lapse. Here's cool art. Rebecca Gade did it. We know what Memory Lapse does. Diminishing Returns. So instead of Days Undoing, my deck has Diminishing Returns as its wheel spell. Each player shuffles his or her hand and graveyard into his or her library. Remove the top 10 cards of your library from the game, and then each player draws up to 7 cards. I like this one because I actually like how it reduces the deck size by 10. So it kind of forces like the games to shorten when you cast it. So, it doesn't prolong the game because, if it has to go down to drawing the last card. Here's Dan Dan. This one's from, I think it's from Renaissance or something. No, not Renaissance. Chronicles. That's what it is. And then this one is from, this is a Japanese foreign black border Chronicles print. And, it's cool. It has a black border. I guess I should explain this. White borders are like either reprints or like second editions and stuff like that. Black borders are first editions, or if they were printed in a language for the first time. So this was printed in Japan for the first time, so it's black border instead of like white border. I feel like that was a concession they made because people didn't like the white border back then, but they were like, oh, we have the reprint policy with the white borders. So this is how they got black border reprints into people's hands, by just releasing them in other countries, so people had to import them if they wanted their black border cards. Here's that guy again. Supplant Form. So I like this card instead of Control Magic. It's a little more expensive. It costs 6 mana, but it's more explosive. Return target creature to its owner's hand. You put a token onto the battlefield that's a copy of that creature. So you can remove your opponent's Dan Dan, and then you get your own free Dan Dan. Or you can like return one of your own Dan Dans to your hand, and then you get another Dan Dan, and then you can cast your Dan Dan again. You get 2 Dan Dans. I like that. I just like it better. Sylvia Knight Temple. Like I said, again, just like weird borders. Like it's red for some reason, despite the fact that it's a blue land. I don't get it. Island. Here's my Halimar Depths. It's from uh, some dual deck or something. I don't remember. But I want to replace this with the printing in this deck eventually, so I'm going to have to buy that as a single. Ray of Command. Here's another control magic-esque card that I prefer. Untap target creature an opponent controls and gain control of it until end of turn. That creature is unaffected, it gains haste. Tap that creature if you lose control of it at the end of this turn. So basically this lets you steal your opponent's Dan Dan just for a turn. I prefer that. Vision Charm, this is the one I use. I use Vision Charm instead of Magical Hack. More Dan Dans. These ones are reprints from Time Spiral. Impulse. So I want to replace these impulses with Telling Time in this deck. But they're kind of similar. So impulses look at the top 4 cards of your library, and then you put one of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. I think Telling Time is a more interesting card, but between the two, only at the time Impulse was the only one that had a retro border frame print, so I prefer retro border frames. So that Impulse is the one I chose, although I'm going to replace Impulse with Telling Time now that Telling Time exists in the old border. So plant form, more Temple of Epiphany, accumulated knowledge. There's my version of accumulated knowledge. So another island. That's awesome. Here's a Dan Dan. This one's an Italian one. Italian foreign black border. I believe this one's from like Renaissance or something, which is like the Italian version of Chronicles. More Dan Dan. It's a Lonely Sandbar. Okay, so this one has a yellow trim around the art, but a blue trim around the text box. What's up with that? Like, these lands just no rhyme or reason. Here's Predict. So Metamorphose in this format's a little more punishing because there's no, only Dan Dans or islands or other lands that you can put down instead of like the control magic. So I guess there is that. Here's Brainstorm. Like I said, Mercadian's Mask. It's like, pretty damn similar to the one in this deck, but different set symbol and a slightly different text. Here's a Mystic Retrieval. So this is the reason why I run the red splash, because you get to add this card, which I find to be a pretty interesting card. So you get to return target instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. And, that's all fine and good. More spell recursion's always good. But it has flashback on it. What flashback is, you can cast this from the graveyard if you pay the flashback cost, which is 1 red and 2 generic. So what I like about that is that it kind of adds another mind game. They have to keep track of the Mystic Retrieval in the graveyard, because then if you cast it, your opponent can cast it too. Or if your opponent casts it, well, maybe you can sneak in and cast it. More islands. There's another foreign black border Dan Dan. Yeah, that's my deck. Just at this point, they're just cards you've already seen. Yeah. So my deck's a little different. Hold on. I feel like there's a card in here I didn't talk about. Like, we talked about Temple of Epiphany, but where the heck is... There it is. I don't think we talked about this. So here's Is It Boilerworks. This is the other red land for the red splash. And this is another land that we can include since we're, using red, which I think adds a lot to the game. So when it enters the battlefield, you can return a land you control to its owner's hand. So say you have an island out and you just keep getting whaled on by their fish, right? We can play Is It Boilerworks to bounce the land back to your hand, so now you don't have any islands and they can't attack you anymore. Not only that, but you can replay your like Halimar Depths or your Mystic Sanctuaries or what have you. You know, I just find the red splash to be an interesting strategic addition to the deck. It does make the deck not mono blue technically, but I think it's worth it. So that's another thing I like about the format is that everyone can build their deck just slightly just a little differently, as long as you have like the Dan Dans and the memory lapses. Basically all the other cards can be subject to change as long as they fit the gameplay loop, right? And yeah, but anyway, that I guess I'll talk about, oh, look at these sleeves, these art sleeves. It has a little betta fish on it. Yeah, that's cool. You know, fish, forgetful fish. You know, yeah, that's it. I'm going to bed.